Okay. I'm going to pop to the next slide, which is a Menti poll. And while Damiana, you want to introduce why we're doing this at all, if folks could click through and try to answer the question in front of you on the Menti, that would be great.
Yes. Taylor, are you going to, for whatever reason, I can't click in what appears on the screen. Are you able to copy the link on the chat?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, thanks.
Done. Let me just end the slideshow. It'll be easier. Oop. There's this. And the code you're going to want to put in is 547. All right, let's see if that works. Go ahead.
It works. I clicked it and it takes me that. So now that we have taken care of that small technical issue, it's 3:02 and we have a packed agenda. I don't want to take a lot of time, but I do want to say welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us to this session. And basically this session, the origins of this series of trainings that Taylor and the BACS team have prepared came out of the original human-centered design applied at MCC 101 a couple months ago. We received positive feedback and a lot of requests if we will do a couple more sessions in depth for people to become more familiar with the methods, how they work. And I think, this is a recognition that our team, the BACS team currently, it's only 3 people, so we can only extend ourselves so much. 2, there is a lot of interest in people. We have currently maybe 14 or 15 countries that in one way, shape, or form have invited the BACS team to help them with some formative research for a specific issue. And we think that being able to understand better what it is, how it works, why it matters, and especially all of these questions being addressed to the MCC context will be truly beneficial for all the teams. So without much more to say, I do want to pass it to Taylor, who is our master trainer. Taylor, thank you for preparing this.
Okay, thank you so much, Domina, and thank you for coming. Just in case anyone doesn't know who I am yet, I am an Associate Director of Behavior and User Experience. And the reason that I am in this role is because I started my career off in international development right here at MCC, working in program ops in West Africa. But until returning last year, I spent the better part of about 10 years managing research into human needs and managing research teams that would surface the kinds of insights about people and their situations that would help guide companies and foundations in their strategy. Basically, how do they provide the kinds of services that are most useful for people? And now MCC, I think it's safe to say, is at the forefront of international development institutions in trying to apply that same mindset to how we design our programs. So let me look at some of the answers. You may see them if you're still in the Menti poll, but I'll read through a few of these questions. What have you been wondering about UX? Will it cost time or add cost or time to program development? We will talk about that. How does it incorporate other aspects of designs like stakeholder engagement, PDIA, validation workshops? Yep, we will get into that. Why you all, I assume that means the BACS Hub, aren't automatically assigned to country teams? Yes, we will talk a little bit about that and the ways that we can be assigned when it's useful. There are a lot of questions here. What's the difference between UX and human-centered design? Short answer is we're going to think of them as the same thing. How to capture user input generally, we'll definitely get into that. Wow, these are really good questions. If they are not answered in this session, the good news is we have more coming up. So, for context, today is part of an ongoing series into what it means to apply UX at MCC. Today, we get the overview. What are the powers of UX, user experience, and what can they do for us? Next week, this same time on Wednesday, we're going to have a more tactical conversation on how to deploy a few very common and valuable methods in order to understand what people need. And at the end of January, a session we will co-lead with M&E colleagues is about identifying and testing and designing for assumptions that we make explicitly about users. We make a lot of assumptions about users, and we can be more explicit and confident in how we do that. So if you can't make any of these sessions, we'll be recording them, we can share them, we can follow up with you afterwards, but I encourage you to join. Today, by no means will we have time to get into all of the methods that fall under the umbrella of user experience. We will breeze over 6 of them, and hopefully we will get interactive with 3 that I've heard a lot of interest about and that we've applied to past programs. However, we've got materials and practice resources ready for everything that we're covering today, and we can follow up to share all of those tools. If we succeed in what we're trying to do, by the end, you'll have a glimpse into what this is, and you'll have answered that question about how is it different from human-centered design and why are we doing it? You'll know some of the case studies of how we've used at MCC. You'll know how to engage the Bucks Hub, which consists of Allison Montgomery, Metzi Hanold, myself, Isabel Dillner sometimes, and Donna Sherrard, who's our consultant on the line. And I really do hope that we'll get some of your input on how we can be most supportive to teams. Okay, one more side note before I get into the questions and substance is that we don't have all of the answers. In fact, I was reticent to even title these sessions trainings. We have a lot of ideas and experience and questions for everyone at the agency about how to make these ideas feasible and practical and relevant to the work of MCC. So I will be asking questions, and we'll try to keep my eye on the chat for answers. Speaking of which, yes, I can see the chat. Great. So questions for you to keep in mind during this conversation. Once you've heard some of these things, I hope will persuade you that it is worth, well, why we should be more user-centered. So keep thinking about how you can be in program design and what that means in terms of changing current approaches or processes. It's not transformative change, I'll argue. It's some new ways of asking questions differently, or maybe stopping to think critically about the user's perspective during regular development process. I'd also really love everyone to think about and share thoughts about the most opportune moments where we, the folks at the Bucks Hub, can contribute to program decisions, because it's not like there's one single perfect time for us to be involved. The best time to be involved is when we can help inform a decision and make it easier, and make everyone more confident that it's the right choice. And this question came up in the Mentipoll. I love that, which is how UX cannot extend timelines per se, but help us meet expedited program development timelines. Here we are. And Omar, yes, got your question. I actually want to take that on right now because I do think that user-centered design is a way of applying the ethos of country ownership to its core. Everyone works at MCC appreciates that country ownership is what we're trying to achieve. I think we also in the UX Hub are trying to expand the notion of country ownership beyond just the ministries and beyond just government leadership to the people who implement and experience our investments. Why? I think in the next few minutes, if you're not already on board, you'll understand that UX can improve the program development process and our focus on results. Let's define it. The truest definition and answer we can come back to over and over again is that UX is both a mindset and a set of methods for gaining insight into what people need, into how they will interact with MCC investments in the real world, and as a result, for creating effective solutions for the people we serve. When I use the word solutions here, we're talking about programs, systems, services. It may be a product that goes out into the field, whatever it is that we fund to drive outcomes. And there are many rigorous methods and technical guidance we will start getting into today, but the mindset is really the core. It's based on pursuing the expertise and understanding of the people at the center of what's being delivered. If you were at the Dean Carlin session earlier today, he started off by saying MCC is a place that takes evidence seriously. And we're here to say that user insights are one type of evidence that we should be taking as seriously, along with everything else that we include in our evidence-based decision making. I also will give credit, and everyone should recognize that we're already doing it to some degree. This isn't brand new to the world of MCC or to our research, but there are ways to be more focused in how we do it so that we can become more systematic. So we're not necessarily playing it by ear or making up rules as we go on how do we apply a user perspective at critical stages in compact development. We can become better organized. We can go back to processes and tools and templates. We can assign team roles to ensure everyone knows who's responsible for understanding what the user needs and who's responsible for folding that into our documents and plans. It'd be more appropriate, and this is really the thesis, because UX and human-centered design starts all design from the problem to solve rather than a solution that may or may not be solving the most important problem for people. We can make it more efficient because I believe doing it right means offering an alternative to costlier, more time-consuming approaches that would define needs and solutions, only maybe defined down the line that they are not the right solutions for the need. And then we'll say that it can make our teams and programs more effective by applying evidence. Thank you, Dr. Carlin, about real-world experience and the kind of evidence that honestly is often neglected in international development planning. Cool, Ryan, yes, I love that comment. Moving on. So you have obviously heard of user-centered design or human-centered design. For our purposes, that is the same thing. The term originated as a formal academic field in design circles because the world ends up with things like this. People design things that don't always make it easy for someone to use them. Examples like this are not unusual. There are so many online threads where you can find hilarious, sad examples of stuff that just doesn't make sense. And it's not for lack of, it's not for malicious reasons. People get busy, there's simple oversight. But I think really, especially in the world of MCC, there's a complex web of can be engineers and contractors and so many people involved in implementing something. They don't always speak to each other, and the more involvement and complexity, the more vulnerable the end product is to design flaws. So to avoid something like this, or an impossible to use toilet, or an impossible to reach customer service hotline, the field of UX has now become huge. In the world of technology, it is ubiquitous. there's no device that you use today that hasn't been based on years of research that dictates everything about its form and its style, its interaction, even its personality trait of a device. And the difference between good applied UX and bad is pretty obvious to consumers. So the sad face on the remote controls is just this classic example of something that's really hard to understand and work properly when you approach it. Versus the iPhone, which now has the abilities to literally just you press a button and it anticipates your needs. It's next to your other phone and it's doing things you don't even understand, and all of a sudden it's absorbed all of your old capabilities and contacts, and it just works for you. Good UX in the product world means things work more like an iPhone like this, work more intuitively. So what does it mean at MCC? We'll go briefly through this top box. It's a paraphrased statement of a real compact and results, the Armenia Compact from 2006 to 2011. There was a assumption at the core of the program logic that people would want to shift to high-value ag to increase their incomes. That logically led through to a notion that provided with improved irrigation, training, credit, and market opportunities, that's the shift farmers would make. In the evaluation that happened after the compact ended, we found less than 1% of the treatment group adopted on-farm water management practices. Why would that happen? The evaluation stated an underlying reality that the people we were working with were interested in diversifying their income sources beyond agricultural production. And this is not cherry-picked. This is the kind of result that we have seen come up in a lot of MCC evaluations. So I'll just very briefly cite, there's an internal meta study where we've reviewed on the Bucks team all 103 independent evaluations that were published up until, I want to say, 2023. And 85% of them noted that MCC's programs had, in some ways, faulty logic, meaning assumptions that lack justification and evidence supporting their linkage to the problem. Doesn't mean that everything about the program had faulty logic, but it existed somewhere. If there are questions, happy to get to those. But seeing none, I'll move on to the bottom and the ideal that we're trying to reach with doing UX really well. It's hypothetical, but is our way of imagining how might we adapt with some solid user insights. We can start with the exact same assumption. People want to shift to high value ag. But we might pause and do a little bit of research that leads us to realize actually people want to diversify their sources of income. Farming is not a no-go, but it's something you see as a part-time trade, and they're motivated to pursue other things, which would result in entirely different program logic, saying that small business owners can become more productive if, say, they're given a choice between new trade opportunities or specialized ag that these irrigation systems could serve. And of course, I'm speculating the results could be that for some, the water management practices raise income. For other, income comes from new sources. I would point out that even in the program logic, something like small business owners is a way of reframing the way we understand who we're working with, from farmers to maybe a way that they see themselves as something more expansive than just farmers. So a brief pause, because I think this could feel like a bold claim. Does this make sense? And does this feel like a worthwhile conclusion that you've seen? Yeah, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks for this. And yes, I agree with your analysis here. So two things, because this looks a lot like some other ag projects that we've worked on. And I think these this I think goal of shifting people to high value agriculture is a common theme. And I completely agree with the way you've sort of shifted the perspective of like who are the beneficiaries that we're targeting. And just to kind of work through that in a similar exercise on a different compact, trying to do something more focused on user research, we asked people who the beneficiary was, and then tried to piece out what the problems were in the eyes of the beneficiary, and had people fill out forms individually. This was on both the core team, so in the country, and the MCC team. And it was like split probably 3 ways between different types of beneficiaries. So I think like understanding how we frame this in terms of either farmers or small business owners is really important.
Mhm.
But I do want to recognize that there's sort of this constraint in the way we break this down at MCC, because we are starting from our step 1 is sort of predefined sometimes. So, if we find that the binding constraint has to do with agriculture, I think our mindset goes directly to farmers. And then we do think about them as business owners, and we've widened that. But the intervention, I think, it's sort of like the framework we start with, our default is already in that sector, and it's hard to sort of think outside the box once that's defined.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, Damiana.
Yeah, just briefly responding to Jenny's observation that, our system sort of walk us through some default path. I don't disagree with that, but I just wanted to like maybe highlight, and Taylor, you can do this probably better, is that user-centered design is really sector agnostic. So if the constraints analysis has said this is the sector that faces the different constraints and barriers, what our team at the behavioral experience can do is first help you carry a root cause analysis that is a little bit more rooted in all the humans from that sector, sort of helping you identify really in a little bit what you did, Jenny, right? Like, let's individually make a list of everybody who can be impacted or it's part or plays a role in this sector, right? And then how do we sort of group them, and how do we reach them and do some of this research in a way that we understand their different constraints? It doesn't mean that we're going to fix everything, right, for everybody, but we're trying to understand a little bit more from the user perspective, from the humans that make part of the system, what it is. So, if the constraint is ag, then we want to be able to talk to everybody in that ecosystem of ag to understand what is the constraint. It doesn't necessarily say, oh, focus on the farmers, or focus on the, credit lenders, or focus on, I don't know, the customs that handle the exports or whatever. So I think it's important to see that this is actually the value added. But I don't know, Taylor, you can add more about that.
Yeah, I actually really like that response. I think one of the big questions that it helps us to define with the team when we come in, and fortunately, if you come in at this point of the constraints analysis, then there are so many directions we can go, is what is open for debate, right? So if you're open to saying that low returns on agriculture constrain economic growth, and that might mean that we want to pursue economic growth through other means, then we've got such an open-ended place to think about who's involved and what are the types of solutions to explore. But it's possible that because of government priorities and because of MCC strategic priorities, there is a smaller focus. And then we would think within that, what's feasible based on how people also agree that there are problems they want solved. I hope that answered the question. I'm actually going to make a similar point in a couple slides, so let me move on. And because I glossed over this earlier, I will skip, but here's the value prop in one place. And I'm only going to re-stress the word efficient here again, because we believe very strongly that using UX can de-risk what we do. Designing it well from the start prevents huge delays and course corrections down the line. So getting a little bit to your point, Jenny, about when things are sort of sealed in and our frame of mind is only going to let us do a certain type of intervention. There's no one way or moment to get involved with bugs, but you should think about engaging us anytime before a decision has to be made around what you fund. And the earlier we get involved, the more we could advise on major design choices, like, is that the right population? Do they agree that that is the right problem? This whole graph is just to say, we all know the life cycle phases that MCC goes through in development to implementation. And at each of those phases, the CDT or MCA or our teams, we have our own focus. So first, it's about what are the goals. Moves on to, well, what's the logic if those are the goals we want to meet and how do we fund? And it gets more and more specific, of course, into the activity components and the metrics. And then there's not a lot left to change. You're going to implement and monitor and report on the projects. And there's a way to engage users in bringing the best version of solutions to life then. But here is really where Buck's input evolves a lot, along with what the team is doing. Early on, if we're involved in the RCA stage, our help can be most useful, I believe, in clarifying the problem and causes, understanding how norms and behaviors combine with macro trends and policies to create the constraints that we're looking at. Later on, it can be about prioritizing the root causes that we're addressing, largely by getting users to help define the drivers of the problem, their unmet needs and challenges. And then I would say, and Allison and the rest of the team will probably say more on this, a lot of our work happens in development after this point where we're supporting the CDT or the MCA to apply the UX thinking in how they design the program. So you've got an idea of what you want to do. How do you do it well for people? And the big difference is, we'll just click on through, that early input can be fundamental to what is delivered, whereas later input tends to offer more superficial guidance. So, if early on we're talking about the social dynamics that shape farming practices and the relationships that will dictate whether someone even chooses to go into farming, that has so many potential implications. Later on, still valuable, but the input will be more on the level of, we're doing irrigation. What kind of nozzle do we use? How do we deliver trainings? What information is most important for the farmers who receive supplies? And how do we communicate that in a way that's going to really resonate with them? I'm just going to pause to look a little bit at the comments. I do want to pause and mention or raise Stacy's question. Still stuck on the finding that 85% of MCC projects have faulty logic some way or another. And I'm going to pass Mitzi, who says, happy to chat with you offline to unpack this one. Mitzi, would you maybe just say one tiny word on where that came from? Because I don't want to have people too shocked.
Where it came from? Well, we did do a review of, I think it was 130 reports, and I, in that review, pulled out what the external evaluators were saying, and that's where that percentage came from. And it was something actually that was also brought up in one of the principles into practice papers. So it was not an unknown finding. I think sometimes the findings there just aren't responded to maybe well, it was responded into the principles and practices. Needless to say, it's definitely something our team has been thinking about and responding to in a paper that we hope to share out more widely.
Thanks. Great. So I am pretty close to on time to move into practical methods now. We've done most of the theory about why to apply UX. Now, how do you do it? What does it mean to approach a problem from a UX perspective? First of all, the green text at the top, it has to draw on the full team's collaboration. It's not something that's just siloed to Bucks. This applies both to our teams internally at MCC and to the country teams that we work with. So we collaborate to determine the most valuable way to bring UX research and design into the activities. And you could say it goes through these 4 simple steps where we're working with you to think through these kinds of questions. First, what do we mean when we say users? Stakeholders is often a good catch-all, but I think in reality and in practice, we tend to focus a lot more on stakeholders who are, again, at the government and decision-making levels in a country, and a lot less on those who experience what we fund and our interventions. And then we want to define the questions that we need answering around the challenges people face, what they're actually trying to do, and in a lot of cases, like what kind of behavior obstacles might actually threaten the ability of a project to achieve its outcomes, and making those explicit. The focus of today is then selecting the right methods. So wide world of UX methods, we want to start with what we know and what we still need to know. We can also think about what's going to be the most compelling way to tell our story, maybe to the host country government, maybe to get everyone on the same page internally, and think about how much user engagement that really should involve. And once we have selected and applied those methods, the final step is integrating whatever we've learned, all of the insights we've learned about people into our plans. I am losing track of the chat for now, but I will try to come back to it soon. I'm going to pause, though, to let Allison Montgomery say a brief word on practically how does Bucks get involved. So, Allison?
Sure, thanks, Taylor. Yes, so there are several ways that the Bucks Hub can support. We have 3 main opportunities or modalities for us to support various country teams. One is our most intensive, and this is when either behavior change or UX or both are a big part of what a country team needs to do. And it requires us to be a part of the design, the development leading up to that, and then perhaps also the implementation, and that's us joining a country team. What we've been learning at our time working at MCC is that it's not always necessary for us to join country teams. Sometimes it is, but sometimes what a team needs is simply surge support, and that's a member from the Bucks Hub joining a country team for a short period of time, be that 6 months, a year, 18 months, whatever it needs to be, to get the job done, get the team on the right track, and then move forward. And then we also have technical support as needed. So that could be, for example, the Bucks Hub coming and supporting with root cause analysis facilitation, co-creation facilitation, or a technical review of some documents. So there's a lot of different ways to engage us. Back over to you, Taylor.
Thank you. All right, if you join the session next week, we will talk a little bit more about practically how we balance team roles. This is a sneak peek slide from how we balance that across all of our technical leads in the MCAs. But let's just talk about choosing the most helpful methods. And this is a silly comic. Feels like you haven't heard a single thing I've thought. I will probably say a lot of times that like UX research is not rocket science. It feels really familiar often when you get down to the core. That does not mean you can't be rigorous about it. And it takes skill and practice to do well. But we are here as resources, as are our vendors that we contract. So the right method depends on a few variables. Here is an easy way to go through the questions that will lead you to the appropriate cost and time and rigorousness type of method. First, you need to understand the decision you're trying to make. And so here's an imperfect flow diagram based on the Malawi tax payments activity, where the question may be, what features does an updated rent collection system need to include to facilitate tax payments? Well, what do we know? I think they knew at some point that users find invoices confusing and bills hard to pay. I think that was actually something learned as a result of sort of early research. But it was unclear what information or process will make it easier to pay taxes on time. All right. If it's unclear, do you have any starting hypotheses? It's great when you do, because then you can be more narrow in how you focus. In this case, let's imagine the hypothesis is users prefer to pay by phone and track their invoice to show when payments are received. All right, so if we believe that this is true, maybe we believe it because it's the case in other countries and we can extrapolate from similar markets. How much time does the team actually have to think about this? And there is never enough time for everything, but there's always enough time for something. Like at a minimum, if you have less than 3 months, you'll speak with some experts, some key opinion leaders, some technical engineers, and you'll move your hypothesis forward with more confidence. Say we've got 3 to 6 months, which is often sort of the sweet spot where we bring in Bucks consultants. That would give us enough time to build a very low fidelity prototype and maybe get input on click-through rates. I'm saying that will give us enough time, and I'm also just thinking like procurement takes time. Flexibly, let's imagine that that gives us enough time for a low fidelity prototype that lets us test how well this hypothesis bears out in reality. And there's one final question that will have us think about what method makes sense. And it's what kind of data is going to be useful for whoever is signing off on these decisions, right? So if you need empirical evidence, a co-design session might not get you there. A co-design session could give you so many good anecdotes and such a strong sense that you know what people are thinking and wanting. But is that going to be convincing to, the CEO of the MCA? Maybe you need something like a quick mobile A/B test, and that's where we can bring someone in. Okay. So that first question that we need to ask is, what is known and what is still needed? That's where we want to work with you guys to figure out what kind of method to apply. There are a lot of frameworks out there, but I like this one because it centers on the decision that you need to take in light of the information you already have. So bear with me for just maybe 2 minutes on this one. If what you know, and I'm going to use a hypothetical saying that we're in an energy-centric compact. If what we know is what's relevant to people in broad strokes, so let's say we know that the lack of power is a problem, but perhaps we're in the dark about how people access power, when it is reliable and when it's not, and what keeps people from accessing power. Then you need some insights into what people need, really formative research. What are they struggling with and why? You can build from there. Say you know that stealing energy is really rampant. So you know what is happening, you know what people are doing, but you're not sure about the circumstances. So you don't necessarily know who's stealing and where and how they get into this and how easy it is. And so you want to understand more of the social conditions that enable these behaviors. That's a different type of method. Maybe you have some informed but untested assumptions, and so you want to refine those. You want to validate those. The energy example I'm thinking of is you've got literature that shows stealing occurs on new power lines a lot more than it occurs on old power lines. And you've got an assumption that it's actually just easier to tap those. Now you have to know why. Why is it easier? And why not try it across the board for everything? How can you shift that variable of ease? And then this one is really, really simple. Say you have a lot of ungrouped data and you need to categorize it. That's where we're going to get into synthetic types of methods that reveals patterns and clusters that we can address. And this, you might notice already, is building on having more and more knowledge down the slide. If you got insights into people's needs and behaviors, you wouldn't start up here, obviously. What you kind of want are users to help you think through the opportunities on how to improve their experience. back to the tapping power example, say that's the insight we come up with is that people are tapping power lines when they're new because they think that's their best chance to get power. Like that's before someone has set guards or safe securities around it, and it's, I don't know, maybe it's fresh, and there's just this built-in idea that that's when you can be more effective with it. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what they necessarily want, but it feels like the most convenient option. So we listen to people's ideas on, oh, what makes something convenient? And then finally, if what you have are some ideas about how to make it less convenient to tap power lines to steal power, and you've got some early solutions, you go to ideation or co-design to come up with ways to deliver and design solutions. These are simply ways to title the kind of method that is going to fall into these buckets based on what you need to know. With a huge caveat that we often use a mix of methods. You might need insights on people's context at the same time that you need to validate assumptions. It's harder to combine methods sort of toward the top of this with those at the bottom of the list because you have to have a different set of knowledge you're basing it on, but this is a way to think about how you start. And before we get into examples of each of these types of methods, just be very clear that many methods are good for generating different kinds of insights. You look at something like an interview, key informant interviews, panels, you can get so much good data in all of these categories from those. But few methods are good for everything. So journey maps is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. Journey maps are really good early on, truly great. They can tell the story of the ecosystem around the user. They can validate assumptions about what really are the biggest problems at the biggest moments in the journey from trying to apply a service. And this model is just to illustrate that we want to be clear both about what we're trying to achieve and how we're going about it. All right. I am going to look and see if there's any hands up. I don't see hands up. All right, we're in the process of compiling a catalog of methods. Omar Hopkins, yes.
First of all, hey, Taylor, it's been a very long time. So the question I had, I just put it in the chat, but maybe you can address it. So you're presenting kind of a list of tools and strategies and approaches and issues. And I'm wondering, how much is this something that you see us as MCC staff doing? How much of this is the responsibility of our due diligence consultants, or how much of this is the responsibility of our country partners through their consultants? Thank you.
Cool. My quick take, and then I'll throw it out maybe to Damiana or Allison, is that it depends on how complex the question is and how critical getting it right is to the design choices you have in front of you. So if it's a really, really complex question about like, how are you going to change people's behaviors when it comes to making payments on taxes or taking different health practices, those are hard to know without collecting firsthand data. And so I would probably defer and advise using a vendor. We've got good vendors for it. If it's something that we have a lot of examples that we can reference, we can often do sort of some more scrappy research or quote unquote research with a lowercase r among our teams with the MCAs and think through it in the same way by applying the same mindsets, but not going through such a rigorous exercise. Does that make sense, Damiana, Allison, Jenny?
Yeah, that makes sense. I would jump in and add, Omar, thank you for your question, that it really is context specific. What we usually recommend is that if there is a user experience question that a technical lead or a team is facing, just come and chat with us, and then we can help you think through from our perspective and with what we know, what might be the best solution. Sometimes it is as easy as writing something into an existing or to be done in the future scope of work for an already established or a contractor that's being hired. Sometimes it's more us bringing in our consultants as well, and we make sure to do that sensitively in a way that doesn't take up more time and doesn't double use resources. We want to make sure that it's efficient and that works with contractors that are already out in the field. So it really is a case by case, but we do recommend that we just start by having that conversation.
Perfect. Jenny.
And just, I'm sorry, one more thing I will add that in addition to being context specific, it's situation specific. So in general, as I said in the beginning of the session, we only have 3 people within the MCC headquarters that are user experience behavior insights specialists. And therefore they themselves, in terms of managing the scope of work and technical directives and helping the team, we have resources, but we can't stretch ourselves infinitely. And we do have 2 contractors that are HCD due diligence funded contractors that can be mobilized to the country. And we can also help other practice groups draft certain sections of a scope of work or a technical directive, so you get the tasks and the requirements that you need, if that's your preferred option. If that's, sort of your MCC due diligence contractor that you want them to maybe add this type of specialty, maybe that's not within their original scope and maybe you come to problems with that, and or help the MCAs draft some of that work. But normally what we do is also like, it depends on what resources are available within the other practice groups within MCA, where in the life cycle of the compact you are, how much leeway do you have to mobilize. Sometimes, if you need something within 3 to 6 months and you're just going to launch a contract, you might not have that answer in there. So it just, as I say, as Alison said, it will be good to reach out to one of the people in the hub, and they can help you through these questions to determine what's the best pathway forward for you to think about this.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Jenny?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One is that it seems like timing is very important in this context of deciding, is this in-house, and also the method, right? Like, you may be able to do semi-structured interviews, and often during the root cause analysis, we are holding focus groups. They're a lot less systematic probably, and we do the interviews, and so some of that would just be like systematizing what we already do. But I think in order to answer some of the questions that Taylor has raised, I feel like this needs to be in a contract that happens before the MCA exists. Like if we're defining who the end user is, that seems like step 1 to me. And by the time we're entered into force with an MCA, I would hope that we're not revisiting that. And if we are, that may cause some problems for the already designed project.
100%. Yeah. All right. Donna has also seconded that point. So thanks for making it. Monica, I'll take your question and then we'll move on.
Sure. So my understanding of user-centered design is that it's an iterative process. And when you apply it to the way the MCC project development is set up, to me, it's iterative on several levels. In that, prior in planning, there's a whole iterative set of user-centered focus element. But when we're at the implementation stage, where we are actually, we have a prescribed scope of work, we have specific budget. The user-centered design element frames a little different than what we did in the planning phase. So when you're setting up guidelines, are we focusing, and if you are setting up guidelines, is it focused on the developmental phases of the program, or how will that work when we're looking at that process in those views?
That's a really hard question. I love that question. I would say the ability to iterate is, yes, key to the ethos of everything is user-centered design. You will only learn so much early on, and then you learn more once you put it into experimentation or into implementation. And how much you can adjust after that is going to depend a little bit on sort of what you've set down in compact plans, of course. I think one guiding rule for knowing what's possible to adjust based on user input is sort of setting aside again, like what's still up for debate and what might we change in a contract. Having ongoing engagements with users who are providing that feedback around the reality of this is how we're receiving the program. This is, how the contractors are working with the communities. That's one safeguard that makes sure we at least keep our ear to the ground on how well things are working. The question is then, like, how do you triage over what can be adjusted at that point and what's already kind of baked? I'm not sure if they answer the question, but yeah.
So that's good. And the reason I asked that because we are looking at this on the Lesotho Compact. It's in the back of my mind because we are applying user-centered design elements, and it's integrated into the scope for the design and construction contract, and needed to put the expertise there. But we're already confined by two constraints of scope, actually three: scope, cost, budget, and time. So with it being an iterative process, it limits and confines how much you can do because of that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a workaround.
It's a conundrum, and actually, thank you for mentioning that Lero and Lesotho, because we're going to get to Lesotho example when it comes to journey maps later, and maybe Donna or Mitzi will have a better answer than I have specifically on how you're dealing with it there. But let me move into methods.
Sure. Taylor, let me pop in and Monica just give you a really quick example of something we can do. So in one country team, we knew that we were going to be building out a sanitation network with requisite household toileting and hygiene facilities. And so the question came up, what exactly are we going to do in regards to those toileting facilities? And it was just kind of assumed at the beginning that, well, of course, there'll be seated toilets because we assume, and some others made the assumption that that was the gold standard, and we want to give the gold standard. So while some of the other design and engineering work was moving forward and the ESP work was moving forward, we had the opportunity to go out and in an efficient way that didn't take any more time, do some UX work with communities and think through how they might use these and what it means potentially to have a shared toilet or to have your own toilet seated versus standing. And what we learned is that people in most areas really preferred a standing toilet, which was also more cost effective. So sometimes the infrastructure design work can move forward at the same time that we go out and quickly ask these kinds of questions that can then feed into final designs. Over.
Cool. Great example. Thanks, Allison. All right. So the rest of this session is getting into some specific methods, and I have materials that I won't spend a lot of time on for all 6. So immersive observation, semi-structured interviews, those are things that I think we're slightly more familiar with, and I'll just gloss over maybe when you want to use them and what they're best at. Same with co-design sessions. And then we'll spend a little more time on journey maps, card sorting, and usability tests. Hopefully getting into some of the case studies of how we've used those in the past. By the way, next week's session is going to get even more practical into immersive observation, journey maps again, they keep coming up in MCC's work, and personas. So to the question of defining users and who needs what from our work. All right. And all these materials will be shared so you can see them in more detail. Okay. Welcome to the first overview slide. There's one like this for each of the 6 methods, laying out the objective of this method specifically, some tools that we have available, and a little bit of how you can think about the resource needs. For immersive observation, I won't ask anyone to read the objective. I'll read it myself. So this is when you get to see what people are doing and not just hearing from them what they think they are doing. You get their contextual data about them in their environment. You're paying attention to their actions, their interactions, their triggers, their high-low points. This is what we will like to say in, ethno worlds, that it's going to the jungle and not the zoo to sort of see what's going on. It's like natural environment that can offer you a lot more data than we will often get from surveys or panels, honestly. So the timing of how you do this is really TBD. I think ideally what you're talking about is you want to allot half a day to think about the situation that someone's in and look at things that you wouldn't even necessarily expect to see in that space. This, for instance, Omar, is where I would recommend getting professional vendors, qualitative researchers who have strong local experience, who clearly are going to understand the local language, and they're going to be able to surface the kinds of insights that you might not even have known to ask questions about. The one sort of thing that I'll highlight here on the steps is that the observation itself, step 7 here, is just one part, right? There's so much prep that goes into defining what it is that you want to learn and agreeing on the right sample, recruiting people who agree to be observed in their natural environment. Sometimes this means you're in their homes or their workplaces. Sometimes you're in a public space and you can collect information about certain things, but not others on the official records. And this is all where the professional vendors can become really, really helpful in knowing sort of the limits and how to approach everything delicately. Yes, we will share the presentation. And this is something that I would do as a practice exercise if we had a little bit more time. But I am giving a shout out to the first project I ever traveled for at MCC, which was Ghana 1, when we were funding the Lake Volta ferry, whose intention was to save people time in transit and to open up new markets. Bucks was not around then in any iteration, but if it were, what we could have done is shown up to a scene like this of an existing ferry and spend a lot of time observing, sometimes in conversation with people, sometimes not, like what is going on in this space and what can we learn that might help us with the design of the ferry we were building. There's a lot about power dynamics, who's in charge of what's happening here. Say you look at this buildup of people around the truck, like, is this a problem of space? Is there something official that's happening there that we're going to need to accommodate when we think about the onboarding and the offloading systems of a ferry? You can see things like the trucks being loaded to different heights. Is that going to be precarious somehow for the mechanism and engineering of the ferry? Is there a way to distribute the goods more evenly that is safer or even fairer? In terms of efficiency, like you can look at trucks that are parked in different directions. What is that going to mean for actually getting people to and from where they need to go? How could you set up just fairly simple structures that could make this work a little bit better for people with the new service? So this is what it looks like, what it could look like. I would say that in-person observation is so, so great, especially in an office setting. I've done a lot of work in terms of institutional ethnography. So when you've got PIR and you're trying to think about what kind of power dynamics and sources of discomfort and inefficiencies are at play in an institution, observation can yield a lot of really, really good data. And this is just an example of a kind of worksheet that we can offer to teams where to prep you for making observation valuable in the field, these are the questions you can think through with everyone. You may be able to do this also just when you're out on a TDY and there's an extra day or two, you can start thinking about what a vendor would be most valuable for by practicing yourself and doing this just in the field. So I would like to move on for the sake of time and speak to semi-structured interviews. These go by a lot of names, KIIs. The word that I'm emphasizing here is semi-structured because there is a really big difference between sitting down and walking through all of the questions that you have for someone, a respondent, and noting their answers, and in having the kind of open-ended or semi-open-ended conversation that lets them lead you to other data and other insights that you might not have sought. So the purpose is to surface people's reflections and narratives that explain their experience. It gets into their mental models. So how do they actually think about a problem, including what is most difficult and important to them? We do this on every compact to some degree. And here I'm just trying to highlight what makes it go really well from a UX perspective. The semi part of semi-structured is a set of tips here where the researcher really should be using their judgment to follow the respondent's lead. Don't belabor a lot of questions on things that they don't seem to care about. That's a recipe for solving the wrong problem. To ask follow-up questions. And so the next slide is sort of a tool to show how you often get really unhelpful answers, but a good researcher is going to push through those unhelpful answers to get to something more meaningful. To use silence to your advantage. All of the anthropologists and sociologists on the line are well practiced in this. Sometimes that's the best way to get meaningful reflections on what we're trying to learn. And of course, ignoring questions that don't necessarily apply to the person you're speaking to, right? You don't want to make them feel like they're in an awkward formal situation where they are delivering the answers they want you to hear or they believe you want to hear. And then of course we've got, more tactics for doing it well. These are things that would feel like second nature, hopefully, to most of our consultants. But with practice, anyone on any of our teams can do really well at this. And part of what I think Allison was trying to make the point is at Bucks, we want to help all of the teams to be able to apply these types of methods and strategies yourselves. So it's not always necessarily coming back to contracted vendors. So I'm just going to skip through my animation here, but we'll make the quick point that if you're asking a question like maybe how someone chooses an energy provider, you're likely to get so many versions of an unhelpful answer. Like, I just used the default, or someone chose for me, or I literally don't know. And a UX researcher will not accept answers like that as the endpoint. They will push through to figure out, well, how did you find out the other person's choice? And how easy was it to even learn that? And what's the best and worst parts of your provider? And how do you advise a new customer to choose a provider? And you can just do this ad nauseum. This is the kind of research that we love doing, the kind of prep for research that we love doing that hopefully yields a lot better data than we can if we're not there in the field with people. Okay. I'm going to skip over this because I want to spend more time on journey maps, which is the next method example we're doing. I was going to ask who knows what a journey map is. I know that a lot of people have used them. I'm seeing them in the names, like we use them in the Philippines. Most recently, we've used them in Lesotho, and we'll talk about that case study now. The journey map is great for breaking down people's experiences into steps and phases to which you can correspond their needs, pain points, costs, interactions, drivers, behaviors, and anything else that is an important variable at each step. These can be created with the user. You can literally have a template and work with the user to try to input all of the, populate all of the pieces. Or you can do it as a synthetic exercise after the fact, after doing a lot of interviews, and the team can come together to build a journey map. It is not particularly expensive. It's done in tandem with interviews, observations, and things like this. So we're going to unpack this Lesotho example in the next couple of slides. And I think I'll ask Donna to come off mute and just talk about the background of this one.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. I know there's many Lesotho country team people here. So just this journey map example real quickly was integrated into the market-driven irrigated horticulture project with the intent originally, because the Bucks Hub team came in late, to really kind of distill data that was already done during the due diligence process and to kind of make some order to it. And when we came onto the team, there was, again, a lot of work, a lot of different sectors working together to try to help these small farmers navigate this process from rain-fed horticulture to rain-fed farming to irrigated horticulture. So we immediately saw the farmer sitting in the center, or the intended beneficiary sitting at the center, and all of these different steps in this journey. And then we also saw all these different potential drivers and barriers that the project as a whole was trying to navigate to get these individuals to move from where they were to this future state. So in our minds, we saw a way to organize all the data that had been collected in a journey map, because it just fits so naturally. And then subsequently, we've been using it for other stuff that I'll let Taylor talk to. But that was a little bit of the background. We didn't come in at the early stage and design the research intentionally with this, but it was used to kind of help distill what had been collected.
Awesome. I took the time to respond to one comment in the chat. I really love the comment that I got back from Donna and Mitzi that the team keeps referring to these. In fact, I was on a call recently where someone brought this up, and they're referring to these objectives and drivers in the TORs. So the contractors are briefed on these kinds of objectives, and they get to use them as a reference point throughout the design of the work. And that means that this becomes a way to package the due diligence research as a guide for design, basically to help preempt and align everybody around answers to questions that they're going to ask much later on, sometimes for contractors who haven't come on board at the beginning at all. So here's the practical what to emphasize. The previous slide showed the insights, and it translated to these kinds of implications. You can call this box that here says what to emphasize, you can call it a design principle. You can call it a, checklist. The point is, when you are in this phase, everyone who is working on designing something around the activity should be in line about these are the things that they're trying to achieve. We can get Donna. Seems helpful as they prepare for design. Yep. Okay. It is 4:08, and I'm sadly going to skip over this practice worksheet, but I would love, like, maybe 1 minute of anyone commenting of how you might use this. So for instance, we said UX tools are sector agnostic. You could apply a journey map to the journey of preparing a travel authorization. You can set up your template like we have here. If we vaguely know the steps, or we learn from users that the steps are, you've got to finalize your travel dates, and you've got to prepare your SO, then you've got to book your transit, then you've got to fill out your E2, and then you will clearly have to correct your errors, and finally, you will have to receive your approval. You can think through parsing all the component parts out among what is the activity happening at each step, who is actually involved at each step. Great way to identify the users and the people who are going to have an influence on how well or poorly this journey works, and who needs to be prepared to work together. And really, from a designer's perspective, what you care a lot about is the pain point. So at every single step, like, what's hard? What can we fix? And how will that lead us to a potential opportunity? So this is incredibly classic. We will share it. We don't need to talk through it now, but I've semi-populated it so you could think through how to do it for our own systems internally. Okay. We've gone through 3 of 6 methods. Yeah, let me just pause. Any more questions on journey maps, actually, about when they're helpful to use or what makes them especially valuable before I move into the other 3 methods? Great. For times when you need to synthesize data, there are so many methods for clustering insights. I think we have underutilized at MCC a lot of potential tools like digital templates for organizing your information. If you want to talk about AI's ability to contribute to this kind of synthesis, that could be a great other session. But in short, this is about getting us on the MCC and MCA side on the same page with the people we're working with about how they associate certain problems and about what their expectations are, maybe for solutions. This is the term mental model comes up a lot in UX world, where we're inviting users to share their models of what categories things fall into logically. So there are a few different ways of going about card sorting exercises. You would use an open sort when you want users to start with a lot of data about things that they know exist or we know exist, that you're going very bottom up, and they're the ones providing the organizing and principle as to what kind of problems are these actually that we want to solve. And I'll show an example of how we apply this with the Philippines RCA process. A closed sort is the inverse. We know what categories we care about solving. Say the government has already decided that there are 3 constraints that we're going to be working on, and we would be going to the users to ask actually what falls into these constraint categories. There is a risk of this. They all have risks of biasing users toward unnatural models. Maybe they don't think that those are the kind of categories that they would look at stuff in, but it gets back to that question of how much flexibility do we have to stay completely open-ended. And then there are hybrid sorts where you know some things are important, but you don't want to just limit yourself to those. I think this is also a very low resource need exercise. It happens in workshops really easily. You don't necessarily need to bring in, outside vendors. So this is an example that I pulled from Kosovo, where they actually led focus group discussions to help understand household energy consumption practices and attitudes toward various sources of energy. They wanted to get a sense of how people would pay for alternative energy sources. I was not a part of this, but I can share some of the questions from the Kosovo guide, which was after they had organized these different sources and the kinds of things that they would use it for, they got to discuss the patterns around why someone thinks that certain sources are more or less appropriate for respective household tasks. That led them to an understanding of their priorities on energy sources, which would then give them a sense of what do we actually want to pursue if we're talking about funding alternative energy here. The practice worksheet is something that is based on how we did it with the Philippines RCA. This was what we did in a workshop. We had tons of people offering tons of ideas about when it comes to the constraint of poor governance, what are the core issues of that? And I think at the end of the day, because we had people work with us in real Post-its on the walls, clustering things into categories, we ended up with a set of categories that are more true to how the people we'd be working with would actually try to solve the problem than if we had just done it ourselves. I'm pausing here because I realize that there's a question. Culturing insights called for observers, interviews, expertise, which can be biased or subjective. Yes. This, as a UX exercise, is something that we're saying you would want to do with people. So you would bring them in and make sure that our biases aren't what's reflected in the ultimate clusters and categories. Not rocket science, it's pattern recognition. What makes it valuable is that you get to an agreed way to structure the root causes that we eventually design solutions for. Okay, there are just 2 left. And I'm sorry for skipping over so quickly because I know we have 15 minutes. I know that co-design sessions are really familiar at MCC. I think it's incredibly intuitive because it's baked into the principle of country ownership. But it is something that UX designers spend a lot of time doing. And since I would suspect that everyone here is on board with the core ethos of we want to get people's input into whether what we design is valuable, we want to get their at least thumbs up that this is a good idea. These slides spend a little more time talking about how do you get good input when you're in one of those sessions? And then how do you make sure that you can translate that input into design? As opposed to, for instance, simply getting the input and not necessarily weaving it all the way through to the final product. So there are many tools available for this, and we are planning to deliver a deep dive session specifically on methods for designing with users. Use case prompts are a classic one. How might we prompts are a classic one. They inspire people to think about sort of blue sky thinking and then narrow it down further and further into something that's more practical. There's sketching exercises. There's a lot of creative ways to get people's ideas on what good design will include. All right. Let me see what's really important to include here because I realize we're short on time. Okay. So in the Philippines 2 project that didn't ultimately result in a compact, the team worked with the OPM lab who helped us deliver the first US methods training. And they led 2 rounds of UX research and design. The first round, they conducted ethnography around the country with seaweed farmers. And the second was leading these co-design workshops. So as a part of the co-design sessions, they had a few solution areas they heard would be helpful. And those were seaweed boats, drying platforms, and a storage facility. So seaweed boat here is the example on the graphic on the left. And the facilitators asked participants to think through what will it take to bring a seaweed boat purchase to life? And they set it up very simply here. And this is something we could do in workshops without professional facilitators. Above the line, you've got the steps that you need to meet the goal. And below the line, you've got a question of the resources, namely time, about how long it will take to achieve those steps. Which gives you an ingredients list. But what the researchers at the workshop did was push into the questions about how do each of these things happen. So questions that you would spend an afternoon with users talking through are about, great, now we've got this framework here of ingredients, like which of these steps are hard or confusing? That'll point you toward where we can help more, make it something that people will know how to go about. What are your plans for saving money? What is enough money to save? When it comes to gathering materials, how do you know what materials to gather? How do you find the materials? What's the supply of those materials? These are all the kinds of things that you would walk through in a co-design workshop. And I also know that there are co-design experts on the call right now who may have a lot more ideas about how we do this. The last example I'm going to get into is a usability test. So I will just pause and see if there are any sort of thoughts from people's experience around co-design and how well it works and how to make it work well.
You know, I don't know if you answer Hamisu's comment about how do we minimize bias and subjectivity from the observers or interviewers' expertise when you are trying to cluster insights from a UX researcher perspective, basically. What will be a couple of strategies to I don't know that you can completely eliminate, but how do you minimize or manage that?
Yeah. Well, my thought is by doing a clustering exercise with users who are leading the clustering is a really good strategy for minimizing the observer's bias.
So the clustering is not being done by the interviewer or the observer, but by the users. Is that what you're saying?
That's the premise of the card sorting exercise. As it's classically done, you would be bringing the either variables to be sorted or the categories to be expanded with underlying variables to users. And they're the ones providing the categories. When the categories don't make sense, the conversation becomes about like, well, why is it here? Do you really mean this? But absolutely, it's that they're coming up with the organizing principles.
Great, thanks. And I think we have a hand up. I think it's Joel maybe first and then Ryan.
Thanks.
Hi, Taylor. Thank you. A question to what Amisu had just asked too. Who comes up with the steps to accomplish the goal? Is that also a co-design process? Because I do believe that there has been some conversation about like these sort of path dependent concepts of success, right? So like I may not go about this process the same way that somebody else might, and who gets to decide which way is like the right way, and how do you decide whether a plan makes sense, right? And whose decision is that? I think that's a really complicated thing to answer, but it is a question about how deep backwards does the UX co-design process go? Thanks.
Yeah, it is not an easy question to answer. And my short answer is this is why you have conversations early on about who's supposed to be in the room. Excuse me, fighting cold. The triangulation of expertise from people who are going to, be gathering materials, talking about the seaweed boat, from people who have been working in the industry, maybe as small businesses, from people who are working in the government and they understand maybe at a policy level what's hard. This is the combination of all of those perspectives. That's maybe not a satisfying answer because it's no shortcut. It just means that we're gathering more perspectives than it would be us, MCC, our consultants, and the MCA team. Ryan might actually have a better answer for this as well. Your hands up.
Oh, thanks. I wasn't positing to answer the question as much as just to flag that I'm a huge proponent of co-design sessions, and I just wanted to note that we also have formal process steps in many of our partnering and grant procedures related to co-creation. It's an approach that is both a technique but also a formal stage in the development of certain programs and partnerships. So some of it may just be a call for semantics or clarifying how those two relate, but co-design sessions I think can be used quite broadly, but then I just wanted to note there are also formal stages of certain program design activities that also happen under a banner of certain rules related to competitive procurement processes and so forth. So that could be fodder for the deeper dive on co-design sessions that you mentioned.
Okay. I saw one more hand.
Yeah, and I think that Ryan, we can talk offline about this with the Bucks team. So let's chat with it. But I do think that there will be a lot more understanding, or maybe better understanding, after the co-design co-creation session that Taylor will be presenting, I think next week or in 2 weeks. I think Caroline had her hand up, but I think now she put her hand down. Or maybe
No, I had it up, Damiana,
ahead.
and I want to be careful of time because I know we're getting towards the end. But it's always such a pleasure to chat with our Bucks colleagues, and I feel like there's so much synergy between the work you all do and what we on the M&E side do, because I think we oftentimes are asking a lot of these questions during that development process. And we face similar bandwidth issues to you, but really trying to get to those answers. And there is that balance. And so that's where kind of understanding what is that granular specific problem we're trying to solve. None of us can kind of go into what are all the issues and the elements around a sector. And so really getting that precision of what is that problem with a regional focus or a specific part of a different system or a sector that we're trying to address. What does success look like? And then what are the really critical pieces as well that we need to understand, the royal we, the large we, including our partners, in order to ensure that we can have a successful project. Because as you mentioned earlier on, and as we've talked about with Mitzi in the past, a lot of times when we see the breakdown post-program and why we didn't achieve results, it's not that something didn't get built, but it's some of these assumptions about how individuals and actors would or would not behave did not hold. And that's where that knowledge and that critical piece comes in. So just a big proponent of this and thinking about how to bring all of you in earlier in the process, as I said, also being sensitive to the time and making sure we're being thoughtful and strategic and how Bucks gets deployed. And I think part of that maybe is that RCA, where if there are pieces of that root cause that we don't fully understand, we know there's something going on with this particular actor or entity, or there's a role for a certain population to play in the project, but we don't know exactly what that looks like and how that's feeding into some of the problems and the root causes we're identifying. That may be kind of the roadmap to then how we engage on the Bucks side. So just wanted to put that out there.
That's helpful, Carolyn. Joelle, actually, I'm just going to note your question as one of the important things that is hard to sort through. And the team would need to think critically about who gets to decide what are the right components and steps here on each of these. Yeah. Okay. Now that we have just a few minutes, I will say that this last example is maybe among the least tested around MCC's work. We will also be producing a session that is a deep dive into how to prototype test once we have ideas. And that will happen in a few weeks, so look out on your calendars. But if I'm going to close, I've got a good quote here from a great UX manager and company owner, Erica Hall. She says, usability is the absolute minimum standard for anything designed to be used by humans. The most expensive usability test is the kind your customers do for you after launch. The second most expensive is the kind that you put off until very late in the process. So there is a wide spectrum of ways that you can test the usability, the viability of the ideas for our project design. Here is a short list of 6 sort of understood methods that you can take to people. On the left side, they're more abstract, they're more subject to bias. Something like, you just put the hypothetical in front of your users. What would you think if this is what happened? Allison's example of the toilets, standing versus sitting, things like that. You just ask the questions at a minimum. Versus you can go up to more structured tests like wireframe concepts where you're drawing something out. You could be drawing them out in a co-design session, for instance. This is the working in tandem of many different methods. You could create physical prototypes, or you can even create an on-site simulation where you are giving someone a chance to experiment with a new way that a service might be delivered. And once you set that scene, you watch how the users respond. You watch what's confusing for them. You watch what you might want to change later. And as a rule of thumb, although you won't get foolproof or convincing data from the left side of the spectrum, given our budgets and time constraints, I think you should always start with the least complex test possible that can answer the questions we have. And only really resort to something like this when we're really uncertain about how well it will go over, or when you have good reasons to think that 1 or 2 solutions would work and you want to do a comparison. I won't spend time on how this is done. I will share the slides. I will just say that a lot has to happen before you get to a usability test. Please make sure that you've done the research into what people need before testing solutions that might address those needs. And we will work with you to think through whether we're prepared to make a useful test. And this is something that we are thought about experimenting with in Timor-Leste. Not knowing how much time everyone has, I'll just say that these are things that we could actually do in the field before we commit to expensive program decisions. And I will pause. I have gotten through 6 methods. I apologize for rushing toward the end there. There's a lot of content, as you can see, we're really excited to share, and we would love to come around to all of the teams and talk to you about how this can specifically work with you and the projects that you're thinking about. But I'll leave you on this slide that says, next week, we've got a few more into methods for understanding. Following week, we've got a session on user assumptions, and we would love your thoughts on what would be most interesting to explore in terms of methods for designing and co-designing with users and methods for testing and prototyping those designs. I am happy to stay for questions and conversation as long as anyone would like.
Taylor, thank you so much for being awesome and for this very well managed in terms of time, content. I think that, yeah, you did great, and there was such a rich interaction and conversation, and I think a lot more renewed interest on understanding methods and perhaps sort of accessing some of the services from the back. So thank you so much to you, to the team that put this together. It really shows the thoughtfulness and the care that you put into preparing this. So thanks everybody for joining.